What's up, vinyl community? It's your boy Chris, or as most of you know me who followed me over from Instagram or who subscribed to me right here on YouTube, know me as @Tunes from the Man Cave. Coming at you today with part 2 of my jazz series, Tales from the Nightclub. First of all, thank you very much to the very positive response to my very first episode, my very first entry on the legendary Lee Morgan. Today, I'd like to talk to you about somebody a little more obscure, a little less well-known, and by a little less meaning a lot less, meaning the casual novice jazz fan is not going to know who the hell I'm talking about. But after this, hopefully you'll want to. So diving right on in, I'd like to do this episode on one of the greatest instrumentalists in the history of music, but definitely in the history of jazz, the legendary Eric Dolphy. Eric was born on June 29th, 1964 in LA to parents who were immigrants from Panama. As an American jazz alto saxophonist, bass clarinetist, and flutist, also dabbled with the clarinet and piccolo. That's some serious ability and serious talent, guys. His use of the bass clarinet helped establish the instrument in jazz. Bass clarinet wasn't used all that frequently before Eric, and he helped bring it to the forefront on some of his, masterful work. Most notably for me, anyway, that I can think of is on his debut album, Outward Bound. Frequent use of the clarinet on that one. He really pushed the boundaries of the alto sax and was among earliest significant jazz flute soloists. The jazz flute, again, not that frequently soloed in jazz records before Dolphy. He worked sometimes classified as free jazz, but his comps to solos were often rooted in conventional bebop. He picked up the clarinet at the age of six, and within a month, he was playing in the school's orchestra. He learned the oboe in junior high. I've never even heard an oboe, I don't think, ever in person. I'm not sure I've seen one more than once or twice. I gotta say, like in rock and roll, chicks dig the lead singer, or chicks dig, the guitar. In jazz, I don't think too many chicks are digging on the oboe. I think people are digging on the trumpeter or the saxophonist. If you're getting into jazz to get laid, I don't think you're going to play the oboe. So maybe that's why he didn't continue with that one. Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, Coleman Hawkins, they led him to jazz. They were his influences. And he picked up the sax and the flute while he was in high school. He performed locally for several years as a member of bebop bands led by Roy Porter and Gerald Wilson. He got his education at Los Angeles City College, and also directed its orchestra. His early recordings feature him playing baritone sax, alto sax, flute, and soprano clarinet. Guys, and he played all of these well. That's insane ability. That's the ability. I tried to play drums as a child for like 10 minutes, sucked at it. My brother was schooling me and I quit. Full disclosure. I'm not advocating that. It's my competitive nature. I sucked at it. I don't like sucking at things. So the stick-to-itiveness for all of these instruments, and for some of them to come as naturally to him as they did, obviously, if he's in his school's band a month after picking up an instrument, you can just only imagine. It's the kind of the drive and the passion that few people in the history of music can never really imagine. And again, I think I've stated this in videos before, but for some of you guys who've never seen any of my videos, it's that I admire so much about jazz musicians, amongst many other things, is chances are if you're a great singer, you were born a great singer. You came from the womb knowing how to sing. If you're going to be great at the clarinet and the flute and the saxophone and the oboe and everything else that Dolphy was great at, sure, there's some ability in God-given ability in there, but you got to practice your fucking ass off. And it's got to be your life. It's got to be your everything. You've got to stick to it 24 hours a day. Forever. And that's just that kind of commitment that I wish was more prominent, not only in more genres of music, but also in society. But that's a tale for another day. Early recordings feature him playing baritone sax, alto sax, flute, and soprano clarinet. Father built him a recording studio in the backyard. Imagine that, guys, having a father that would build you a recording studio in the backyard. I know some of you guys who might be watching this are in a band, or, have a band, or practice yourselves, or whatnot. But imagine, I don't think any of you had a father that built you a recording studio in your backyard. Early recordings of Dolphy also feature him with Clifford Brown. Just some guy. Some of you might know who Clifford Brown is. More to come on him later in this series, by the way. A little spoiler alert. Dolphy's big break came as a member of Chico Hamilton's quintet, and he became known to wider audiences. And toured a ton in 58 and 59 and parted ways to move to New York, but not before appearing with Hamilton's band in the movie Jazz on a Summer's Day, where he played flute at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1958. Charles Mingus grew up with Eric in LA, and Eric joined him shortly after arriving in New York. He played on Mingus's big band record Pre-Bird, and then joined his working band. They recorded 2 albums, Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus, and Mingus at Antibes. Eric Dolphy left Mingus band in 1961 and went to Europe for a few months, and was later one of the musicians who worked on Mingus. A little redundant. Great classic album nonetheless in 1963. Guys, I apologize for reading. I took notes. I wanted to make sure I got this right. And I wanted to make sure I did it in a good timeline for you guys. I didn't want to do a 50-minute video. I know you guys have shit to do. So I did indeed take notes. In 1964, Dolphy joined Mingus' working band for a short but well-documented tour of the 5-Spot, Cornell University, and Town Hall before leaving Europe. Charles Mingus said of Eric Dolphy, Eric Dolphy was a complete musician. He could fit in anywhere. He was a fine lead alto in a big band. He could make it in a classical group, and of course he was entirely his own man when he soloed. He had mastered jazz, and he had mastered all the instruments he played. In fact, he knew more than was supposed to be possible to do on them. And that's coming from Charlie freaking Mingus, you guys. It's not coming from some guy in some club that you met sometime, but nobody knows who it is. It's freaking Charlie Mingus who said that of Eric Dolphy. Almost everybody who knows about jazz knows who Charles Mingus is. Almost nobody knows who Eric Dolphy is. And that's a damn shame if you ask me, guys. Dolphy and John Coltrane met when Train was still with Miles Davis, first quintet in LA. They learned a lot from one another, and after sitting in a few nights, Dolphy was asked to become a full member. Train had become a star, but alienated some jazz critics when he stepped away from hard bop, as a lot of you guys who have followed Train know. Train's quintets with Dolphy, such as on Village Vanguard, Killer Live album, and on Africa Brass, are now well regarded, but originally provoked Downbeat magazine to brand Train and Dolphy's new direction as anti-jazz. Whatever the fuck that is. That's just basically the way of saying that critics are assholes and critics have no talent. Let's just call it what it is. Anybody can sit back and criticize something. And it's another way of just our innate nature, I think, as humans, most of us anyway, to think that just because it's something we don't like, that it's not any good or it's not cool. I don't like them, so they suck. And I will fight you over it. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. If you like freaking Christina Aguilera and Britney Spears, rock out to that shit and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Tips from the man cave. Coltrane later said of the criticism, "They made it appear that we didn't even know the first thing about music. It hurt me to see Dolphy get hurt in this thing." 1964, Dolphy began his career as a leader on Prestige, the first two albums being Outward Bound, freaking classic, and Out There. Later he signed to Blue Note and recorded Out to Lunch, another freaking classic, which is viewed, of course, as his magnum opus. Outward Bound. Just listened to like literally an hour ago. It still blows my mind every time I hear it, guys. It is a freaking phenomenal record. I highly recommend you getting it into your life. And because I also do the intro to jazz videos where I recommend novices buy reissues, they can be found. The OJC reissue, I know for a fact you can get for under 20 bucks. So get it into your life, guys. It's freaking phenomenal. I love it. So much instrumentation. Almost all of his expertise on these instruments is in full effect on this album. Not as well renowned as Out to Lunch, but in my opinion, it's a more enjoyable listen. A little less thought-provoking, but more casually enjoyable. And because I also mentioned Out to Lunch a minute ago. We'll come back to these albums, of course. This is a vinyl video after all. I'm not a trained expert of documentary making, but I do know some shit about records. After Out to Lunch and a spot on Andrew Hill's Point of Departure. Because, again, vinyl community video. Original mono press. Blue Note. You guys know how I wagon wheel. And on that album, Andrew Hill, Kenny Dorham, Eric Dolphy, Joe Henderson, Richard Davis, and Anthony Williams. Look at the freaking talent on that record. Highly recommended, guys. Highly recommended. Before a show in Oslo, he informed Charlie that he intended to stay in Europe after the tour was finished, partly because of the U.S.'s treatment of artists that were trying something new. Eric Dolphy died accidentally in Berlin on June 29th, 1964. Details are disputed, but it's accepted that he died of a coma brought on by an undiagnosed diabetic condition. Liner notes to the complete Prestige recordings box set say that Dolphy collapsed in his hotel room, and when brought to the hospital, he was diagnosed as being in a diabetic coma. He was administered an insulin shot, lapsed into shock, and died. That's one spin of it. A later documentary and liner notes dispute this. They say that Eric collapsed on stage in Berlin and was brought to a hospital. The attending physicians had no idea Dolphy was a diabetic and decided on a stereotypical assumption of jazz musicians as relates to substance abuse that he had OD'd on drugs. He was left alone in the bed for the drugs to run their course. Eric Dolphy died at the age of 36. Obviously, if you're a black American jazz musician, you must be a freaking junkie. Right? Again, two stories to make this that much more interesting of a story. Interesting, probably not the best word. Tragic being better, I think. I want to make sure I get these quotes right. Ted Curson said, and I'll quote, direct quote, "That really broke me up. When Eric got sick on that date, and him being black and him being black and a jazz musician, they thought he was a junkie. Eric didn't use any drugs. He was a diabetic. All they had to do was take a blood test and they would have found that out. So he died for nothing. They gave him some detox stuff and he died, and nobody ever went into that club in Berlin again. That was the end of that club." Charles Mingus, reflecting on his friend Eric Dolphy after his death. Usually when a man dies, you remember, or you say you remember, only the good things about him. With Eric, that's all you could remember. I don't remember any drags he did to anybody. The man was absolutely without a need to hurt. John Coltrane. Whatever I'd say would be an understatement. I can only say my life was made much better by knowing him. He was one of the greatest people I've ever known as a man, as a friend, and a musician. Dolphy's mother, Sadie, gave instruments that Dolphy had bought in France but never played to Coltrane, who subsequently played the flute and bass clarinet on several albums before his own death in 1967. 36 years old, guys. That's a little more than 2 years older than I am right now. And this guy had mastered close to a dozen extremely difficult to play instruments. According to Charles Mingus, he had mastered jazz. He played with Charles Mingus, with John Coltrane, with Ornette Coleman, with Andrew Hill. In 36 years on this earth, and should have been more. No matter which story you believe, I'm inclined to go with the belief of him collapsing on the stage and them assuming he was a junkie. I'm inclined to go that route because witness testimony, and of course because who the hell, if you're the hospital or somebody wants to come out and admit that you just assumed that someone was black and a jazz musician, that they must be a freaking junkie, and essentially just let the man die without doing a damn thing to stop it. They have words for that. Lawsuit. Whatnot. I don't think anything on that front ever came, and I don't really care about that. It's just a damn shame that one of the greatest jazz musicians in the history of the world was lost to us, 36, and something could have been done about it. That's the sad part for me. And the even sadder part is, again, most of you don't know who he is. That's even sadder. People know who Train is. People know who Miles Davis is. Most people are going to know who Charles Mingus is. You know. But hardly anybody knows who Eric Dolphy is. And again, for all of you who stuck around with me, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to run you guys through a quick stack. Because again, this is a vinyl channel. I want to show you guys some wax of some of my favorite albums that Dolphy ever played on. Of course, again, you've already seen it once. Outward Bound, excuse me. Outward Bound. Honestly, I can sit here and tell you it's one of my favorite jazz records. Again, I listened to it about an hour ago as I was prepping my notes for this video. It is an absolutely stellar listen. Highly recommend it. Out to Lunch. One of the most legendary albums, I think, in the history of all of Blue Note. A little more out there, a little less relaxed than Outward Bound, but it's widely viewed as his masterpiece, and for good reason. Freddie Hubbard, Bobby Hutcherson, Richard Davis, and Anthony Williams. Again, serious talent. Point of Departure by Andrew Hill. Once again, you guys have already seen. It's my original mono press. Phenomenal record. A little more challenging as a lot of things that Eric played on. Killer record. I'm going to show you guys one that most of you are probably not going to know or be familiar with. Where? By Ron Carter. With Eric Dolphy and Mal Waldron. It's on New Jazz. And guys, this is a freaking killer record. A little more experimental again, but I can't think of a single record I've got in my collection that sounds like it. And that's a compliment in and of itself, because I've got hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of jazz records. And for this one to sound different than all of them, in a good way, is a testament in and of itself. The aforementioned earlier Free Jazz a collective improvisation by the Ornette Coleman Double Quartet. My original stereo press, newly acquired, actually, as of a few weeks ago. Phenomenal record, but again, free jazz. So, delving back into my intro to jazz for you guys real quick. Don't start with it. Possibly my favorite record that Dolphy ever played on, period. It's probably between that one and Outward Bound. This one and Outward Bound, excuse me. Oh, John Coltrane. My original stereo press, and a freaking magnificent record. It's on Atlantic. It's so phenomenal, guys. If you don't have it, get it into your life, obviously. It's Coltrane. You already know. Another one of my favorites he ever played on, Africa Brass. Phenomenal. It was a little different for Coltrane. Probably one of the reasons he and Dolphy made such a good team. My original mono press. Absolutely stellar, absolutely phenomenal. I've said this before, nobody did gatefold or sleeves like Impulse. They're just so damn sturdy. They're so beautiful, even years and years and years and years and years and years and years after they were released. Coltrane, live at the Village Vanguard. The ring wear is not the prettiest in the world, I admit, guys, but the record sounds phenomenal, and that's the most important thing to me. This is an absolutely stellar live set, and of course, highly recommended. And to finish out the stack of some of my favorite records that are in my collection, because there are a few that Dolphy played on that I don't have, that I would love to have, and that I might actually even like more than a few of these. Max Roach, percussion, Bittersweet. Phenomenal record, absolutely killer. The percussion, naturally, because it's Max Roach, and when you put the word percussion in your album title, you damn well better bring the ruckus. It's phenomenal. And there's my stack of my favorite records that Eric Dolphy played on that I own. One of the highest ones on my list, I think, right now is I'd like to have his second album, second release on Prestige, out there. I'd love to have that one, especially since I just listened to Outward Bound, and I want to really be able to feel the progression from the ground up from this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful jazz musician. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys come out informed. I hope you learned a little something about a jazz artist that maybe you didn't even know. And if you didn't know him before, I hope this encourages you to go out and find out more about him. I hope this encourages you to dive into the discography. I hope this encourages you to broaden your horizons musically. I hope I showed you a few albums throughout the video that you think, okay, these look cool. I gotta find out what's up about these. I hope so. But furthermore, more so than anything, I just wanted to educate some people about a not well enough known jazz legend, Eric Dolphy, and the tragic way in which he met his demise. As opposed to Lee Morgan in Volume 1 and Part 1, he was not a junkie at any point in his life. He didn't have problems with drugs. He wasn't high in his performances or on his albums. It didn't hold Lee Morgan back musically, obviously, because he was a musical god no matter what. But that's not what took Eric Dolphy out. What took Eric Dolphy out is left up to interpretation, again, if you guys remember my story. But if the story about the assumption of him being OD because it was a stereotypical view that because he was a black American jazz musician, he must be a junkie, so they left him alone to die, is accurate, then that's just one of the fucking saddest things I've ever heard in my life. I'll just leave it like that. So, I know this topic matter is heavy, guys. I intend it to be. I promise to surround these heavy videos with a few more lighthearted videos. You'll probably get one of those before I get to part 3. Spoiler alert, I'm going to do part 3 on the legendary trumpeter, one of the greatest artists of all time, Clifford Brown. So until my next video, and until the next part of my series, Tales from the Nightclub, keep dropping that needle, you guys.